Hey everybody. In today's video, I'm going to talk about the yield curve, whether it's inverted, and how you can chart that in Excel. So on this website, home.treasury.gov, we've got a list of all the different interest rates based on the period. So 1 month, 2 month, 3 month, 4 month, 6 months, all the way up to 30 years. And so typically how interest rates work is the further they are in the future, the higher their yields are, just because you're being compensated for that unknown, for that risk going into the future. Now, with an inverted yield curve, what happens is that longer term rates are lower than the shorter term rates. So it's a bit of an odd situation and not one that typically happens. And so I've entered in these interest rates on Excel, and if I were to chart them out in just a simple line chart here, I can see this pattern, but a way to sort of emphasize this, just because it's got a pretty narrow spread. We're talking about between 6% and 4%. What you may want to do, especially on an Excel chart, to help highlight this, is modify the scale. So I'm going to format axis, right click, format axis, and by default it goes to 0.0, which isn't practical because if our interest rates aren't at zero anyways, it's going to make the changes look very subtle even when they're not. So I can eyeball this and look at this and see that we're not even close to 3%. So I could probably go to set my minimum as 0.035. And now we see a bit of a different picture. Now we can see a bit of a steep decline. And so this is what an inverted yield curve would look like, just because we see that it's sloping downward instead of going upward. Because with a normal yield curve, these interest rates for the 30-year, 20-year, 10-year, they should be up here. They should be higher, whereas these shorter term ones should be lower. So this is not a typical yield curve, and this is what we'd call an inverted yield curve. And so the reason you'll hear people talking about this a lot is because, with an inverted yield curve, that's often seen as a predictor of a downturn, of a recession, and that, that there's a bit more risk than there would normally be. Because what happens is people are getting a bit nervous about the long term, so they're buying up long term bonds, and that's driving down their yields. Whereas in a normal situation, the opposite would be true, when people wouldn't be loading up on long term yields, long term bonds, and so these yields would be higher because they'd need to be higher to compensate for the fact that not a lot of people are buying them. But obviously, if people are concerned about the future, the long term, that can change, and that's why we're seeing that the demand for these long term bonds and interest rates is higher, and that brings down these yields, because the bonds don't have to have as high yields anymore to attract long term investors. And on the flip side, not a lot of people are buying for the short term, just because the short term is a lot more volatile, a lot riskier than it normally would be. Because normally, if you're looking at a period of 6 months to a year, that should be fairly stable. What's going to happen in the next 6 months to a year. So the interest rates would be generally pretty low because there's not a huge amount of risk there. But with an inverted yield curve, you're seeing the opposite effect here. You're seeing that these interest rates are high, so investors want to be compensated for what they're perceiving to be a big risk in the short term and less risk in the long term. And so this inverted yield curve doesn't necessarily mean a recession is guaranteed or anything like that. It just shows you investor sentiment and what people are expecting in both the short term and the long term. So that's why you'll see it get a lot of attention, especially as there's more talk about a possible recession this year. So that's how you can plot out the yield curve. All you're really doing is just going to the Treasury website. You can pull in the different rates, and there's historical data as well that you can pull, and basically just plotting it from short to long term. And then based on that picture, you can see whether it's inverted or not. In a normal yield curve, it'll start from low go high. With an inverted one, it'll start high and go down lower. So that's how you can plot inverted yield curve in Excel.